Hey, stop that. We got a video to do. Are you guys wondering how Inquisitor Martyr is gonna compare with the other ARPGs like Diablo 3 and Path of Exile? Yeah, me too. They are actually some of my favourite ARPG games. What I'll be doing in this video is a side-by-side comparison for you for each game, as well as its features, focus on direction, and major gameplay factors. I'll be doing one of these each month so we can keep an eye on the new content that Inquisitor comes out with, and well, we can see how it matches up with the big boys. Let's get started. So we're going to be starting off with the skills section, looking at Diablo 3 first, and here we have a series of different classes with interchangeable skills, but each class feeling quite unique in terms of playstyle, a handful of different builds for each class, but I do find by the time you get to the late game and you get to that endgame content, you are tunnelled into choosing generally between 1 and 3 different builds, so it can feel a little bit more limited later on. Path of Exile, however, has a slightly more dynamic skill tree for a fairly large and broad character and class series, who are also very much interchangeable. You can pick a summoner and build them into a tank, you can build a melee character and build them into a caster. It really is quite interchangeable. However, there is a little bit of a price you pay here. Due to the complexity, you can't backtrack much, so therefore once you've invested into a character and your skill sets, you're actually stuck with that decision unless you decide to make another character, so there is a drawback here. Now, Warhammer Inquisitor is actually going for a very unique system here. It is linking your abilities directly to your weapon sets, and therefore these are really easily interchanged. And this actually means you can change your playstyle very, very quickly from being ranged to being melee to being a hybrid, just depending on simply what equipment you are equipped with. There is a substantial overlap between each of the weapons, and it's worth noting that a lot of the different weapons will play fairly similar to each other, but again the emphasis is that you can quickly interchange, vary your playstyles, and it does come with some advantages. We also need to hold fire a little bit on being too critical, as all of the weapons haven't been released yet, as well as quite a few of the in-game systems. And next we have the quest section, where we have some differences between the 3 games. Diablo 3 we have one progressive story with infrequent and quite predictable side missions, as well as quests and interactions, which fulfill the usual expectations of RPG games where you gather, you kill, you find, etc. It gets a little bit repetitive, as well as the fact that you play the same campaign through multiple times in order to reach your level progression, so a little bit of a grind. Now, Path of Exile is actually very similar to Diablo 3 with one progressive storyline, which ultimately the player will replay again and again and again on each difficulty, so typically you'll do the same campaign 3 times at least, and then grind more content to reach your maximum level. So, in a word, repetition for both of these is really a key and core concept. You have to be willing to grind. Let's talk a little bit now about the Warhammer Inquisitor quest options and what we'll have available to us. Currently our missions are similar in depth and standard to the normal ARPG missions. Upon full release though, we are expecting a single player story driven campaign, plus open world co-op friendly, and really I'd like to emphasise open world here, inquisitions as well as missions, which are formed of several missions. Currently it's impossible to say if these are going to be truly immersive plots or if they're just going to be a series of missions that have to be grinded out. But what I would emphasise is the open world feature here. This is completely unique out of the 3 games. You can go anywhere you want to go with Inquisitor, although I have a feeling you'll be restricted somewhat by your level. But there is a choice on what you can do, whereas the typical ARPG really just drives you in a straight line to complete a campaign, and then you move forward from there, so it can get a little bit repetitive. So it's nice to see a change of direction here, but we really need to just wait and see what the actual quality of the campaign is like. And now we move on to the actual combat system, where again there are even more differences between the 3 games here. Diablo 3 is quite famous for its really smooth and fluid combat with good visual sort of animations, as well as a very responsive feel to the combat. The action is actually part of what makes this game so enjoyable for many players. It's simply a good button basher and quite a lot of fun just to hack through. The enemies within the game as well come with a standard sort of flavour of RPGs where you have different abilities you have to dodge, duck, dip, dive and etc. through. It's all fairly standard, but again, what really stands out here are the visuals. Then in Path of Exile we have a slightly different direction here. We have a less refined, less graphically impressive combat system with maybe a little bit less fluidity, but more immersion in terms of depth and complexity and detail, which is what makes the game so appealing to the more, let's say, hardcore players that like planning their characters. They like looking at numbers, know what items you should equip versus certain enemies, etc. So it has its place, but it is slightly more limited in terms of appeal and tends to get on better with those hardcore players. Now we move on to Warhammer Inquisitor, where the combat direction is completely different to the previous two, and rather the pace is very, very different. They've opted for more of a cover-based combat system, instead of the usual tank and spank and continually charge at new mobs as fast as you can. I'd say the combat speed currently within Inquisitor resembles that of an MMO, where if you were in a party you would clear one pack at a time with a little snack break in between each one. It will feel slow if you're used to the hack and slash of an ARPG. However, I do think once they up the difficulty of the maps, it may be very satisfying. What I would also say is we've only had access to the tank class thus far, so the only footage we've seen is of the slowest paced combat in the game, so there may be a slight increase in pace once it's fully realised and once we see the other classes. Now, let's have a little talk about the progression, because that's something I'd really like to emphasise between the three. The progression within Diablo 3 is pretty smooth, and it's quite an easily adjustable difficulty level as well. You can gain experience quicker if you want harder mobs, and vice versa. You can play it at a very casual and easy rate if you so wish. The progression works simply by playing through campaigns, gaining levels up until the end game where you gain access to some new content. Pretty standard stuff. Now, moving on to Path of Exile, we have slightly less options in terms of customising the difficulty and the experience gain. You can progress and rather rush to increase the difficulty as fast as you can, but it's slightly less sort of fine-tuning involved compared to Diablo 3. But again, same system, repeating the campaign until you've leveled up and unlocked some more content, so grinding for both of these thus far. Now, the progression in Inquisitor, we don't actually know that much about the full sort of pace of the progression, how quickly you're going to level. It's too early to say because we only have access to early missions. But what I would say is there doesn't seem to be any necessary need to replay the same campaign again and again. Instead, it looks like we'll be revolving our gameplay around these mission-generated contents as well as Inquisitions, as well as the seasons. I'm going to come back to those later though. Now let's move on to the consumables, because there are some real big differences here between the three. So Diablo 3, we have a typical potion system that refills on dealing enough damage to enemies, and that will grant you health back. It encourages the flow of combat to be quite quick, quite dynamic. You go from pack to pack very quickly. Now, what you'll notice is there are some status effects that can be added to the potions, and this is quite customizable, and you get one potion. Path of Exile takes this to the extreme. We have 5 different potions now, which are customizable, each with their own buffs, which effectively gives you another 5 abilities of sorts, be it buffs, health regain or mana regain. So it really takes this and takes it to another level, where the complexity of the combinations can really actually be quite mind-boggling, and I have to say it's too many buttons for me, but I do like the customizability of it. We have a little bit of a halfway between the two with Inquisitor, where we get our one heal ability, which is customised through the player using a crafting system, which we haven't had implemented yet, but we know it'll be crafted, and it will also include buffs, etc. However, it's not going to work like the other two games. It's not going to refill based on killing enemies. It actually makes sense when you think about it. Because of the slower pace, it wouldn't work. What we need is something that simply has a set amount of charges. This, again, is going to be much more like an MMO, I think, where you take a little break and regain your health between mobs, try not to waste too many potions, and then you proceed on. It's an interesting choice and a very different direction for this, and it will slow down the pace of combat somewhat. Maybe a good thing, maybe something they'll be looking to change. We'll just have to wait and see. Now let's move on to the learning curve of these 3 games. So the learning curve of Diablo, first of all, it's a very easy game to pick up and play. You simply need a thumb and a finger, and you can bash some buttons and kill some enemies rather easily, especially in the early campaign when you can just steamroll through enemies and have a load of fun. By the time you get to endgame, you normally know enough about the characters and about the builds to sort of carry on trucking then, and you shouldn't be in too much trouble. Now, Path of Exile, if this was your first ever ARPG, you might get a little bit lost with the learning curve. There is a lot of mechanics in here, there is a lot of very fine minutiae that needs customizing. Even the graphical options and such are actually quite tough to get around, which notifications you want switched on or off. It can actually get quite confusing. I would say it's a little bit less user-friendly, but it is geared towards, and the game's intention is to be geared towards, players that are slightly more ARPG, hardcore and experienced. You will probably get away with being a new player on it, but you're just going to have a harder time, and a few more sort of Google trips and YouTube videos might be required to bring you up to speed. Now, moving on to Inquisitor, I think this is going to be even simpler and even more user-friendly than Diablo, and the main reason is because our weapon set will completely govern our available skills, meaning you don't have to worry too much about the inter-customization and which skills complement which. You simply equip a weapon and off you go. So there is a huge advantage here to picking up new players to the ARPG series. What we need to be careful of though is that the customization and learning curve is implemented then slowly afterwards, and as we gain more passive points and other factors that will help customize our character, that it gives us enough depth to keep us stimulated, because otherwise it could be seen as a little bit too limited. We'll just have to wait and see until this plays out, but it's certainly going to be the easier of the games to pick up and play. You literally point and click as to where you're going to shoot. As of yet, there's not that much information you need to know, but it's unfair to really comment on that as a lot of the mechanics haven't really been implemented yet. Now for my last point, and probably the most theory crafting based, we're going to talk a little bit about the endgame content for each, and I know we're not at the endgame of Inquisitor, but we can make some speculations here. So first up, we have Diablo again. So we've got a large degree of endgame content coming from their cube system, which is really mission generation. What you do is you get to do a trial. How well you do dictates what you can then do, and you sort of progress and get chances to do harder trials and better gear, etc. It's all largely randomized, and you don't get a huge amount of customization to it. You don't get to choose what you're doing. It's all just randomly thrown at you. But it is a little bit of fun, and it's quite good to keep the game going and generate that sort of end game, give you something to do. Similar to Diablo 3, Path of Exile has its own sort of grinding mechanism where you're encouraged to grind through chapters and level up and do some end game dungeon runs that are quite difficult, but really it does just focus on doing the same things again and again and again. I guess that's the thing with all ARPGs, but let's see if Inquisitor does anything different. So similar to Diablo 3, we have the grinding based system where we level up and we slowly progress, we get to the end game, but there is a little bit more detail in terms of mission crafting, and I think we have to give a few bonus points here to say that you can really put yourself through a rougher time if you want to and make your content a little bit more challenging in specific ways if you wish, so maybe there's a little bit of an advantage here. But what we'll do is we'll see if Inquisitor's doing anything different, because I think there might be something to this. Let's have a look. So here we know thus far that we have the open world sandbox with, and I quote, hundreds and hundreds of different worlds and systems that you can go to with their own missions and mini campaigns. A lot of this will be RNG based, so this on its own may be enough to keep players going for a while, but if that's not enough, we also have the mission crafting factors. We don't know exactly what this will entail, how much depth there will be, but it does seem, as they've used the word crafting, that it may be on par with Path of Exile. We'll just have to wait and see on that one though. And I want to mention seasons here. The reason I've not mentioned seasons for the end game for the other two is seasons within Path of Exile and for Diablo 3 encourage you to start a new character and play the campaign through with some minor modifications. But within Inquisitor, the season is going to, from what I understand, extend the current campaign. It's going to put more planets, more systems in, give you more to do, new enemies, new challenges, so it's actually progressing. It's almost like an expansion rather than a here start again with a new difficulty modifier or enemies with big heads, etc, etc, which is probably a little bit unfair to the season system, which is quite good fun for the other two games. But it's nice to see Martyr doing something completely different. Will it work? Who knows, but it is different. So that actually concludes for now episode 1 of my back-to-back comparison, or rather side-by-side comparison, of these 3 ARPGs. We'll have to wait and see how the content unfolds over the months. Stay tuned and subscribe. Remember to check by once each month if you like these videos. I'll be putting them out at a frequent basis so you can keep up with the game and so you know what to expect by full release. Hope you've enjoyed the video, guys. You've been listening to Hydra. Take care, have a lovely weekend.